response? OH? Hi. So my name's Rebecca Jackson. I'd like to welcome you to the 7th, almost annual, Center for Clinical and Translational Science scientific meeting. We were originally funded way back in 2008. And at that time, we really used this venue as an opportunity to come together as a scientific community around new opportunities for collaborative team science research that could really transform or increase the trajectory of clinical and translational science. And so hopefully this year, we have our largest registration, almost 400 individuals and more than 100 posters that I certainly hope that you'll all attend and actively engage with the presenters. But one of the important things this year is to really build upon strengths across our entire university community and with our pediatric partner at Nationwide Children's Hospital to begin to really harness the power of big data across this university by using tools of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and in some opportunities within deep learning to really be able to take data, bring it to information, knowledge, and ultimately wisdom. The CCTS and the concept of this came up in the early part of the 2000s. And it really was a brainchild of the NIH and Dr. Zerhouni as the director of the NIH at that time. And one of the issues was that he understood that both the NIH, the NSF, and in fact academic institutions across the United States had great strengths in the areas of basic science, discovery research, clinical research activities actually at the bedside, and then community research. But what was really missing was that integration between these activities. And so how do we create kind of a discipline that moved things forward that really allowed us to work together in ways that we previously were unable to do, which is ultimately take the great discoveries like the Human Genome Project, computational biology, system science, and all of those areas, and significantly impact human health. And so we recognized very early on that in fact this wasn't a unidirectional process that went from the bench to the bedside to the community to public policy and that kind of dissemination and implementation science, but in fact it was multi-directional. So that when one looks at HIV, for example, it actually started in the community and recognizing that there seemed to be this immunodeficiency occurring that was unique, brought it back to the laboratory, were able to identify the virus, move forward in the development of a therapeutic, and now what was in fact a deadly disease has become a chronic disease that is managed very effectively with new therapeutics. And so that's the promise of translational science, to be able to actually all work together to bring our unique expertise together. But the problem is it does require a different set of skills in order to be able to do that. Different ways for us to communicate across what are these different areas within the translational spectrum. It also recognizes that this is a process that's slow, it's laborious, and so are there ways that we can enhance the efficiency and the effectiveness of moving things forward. And because of that, it really requires teams, and not just teams of investigators like basic scientists, engineers, public health officials, but it also requires our partners, our stakeholders in the community, whether that be industry and private sector, other government agencies, or in fact those that set the policies, the communities, patients, families, and communities themselves. And so it's really working together and thinking about these properties regarding team science. That's a critical component of what we do on an everyday basis. And so the goal of the CTSA program, which is the Clinical and Translational Award funded by the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, or the Center for Clinical and Translational Science here at The Ohio State University, which has been around since now 2006, is really to serve as kind of that translational research engine to actually move forward this transformative approach towards thinking about ways to more effectively do biomedical translational science. And so foundationally, we use things like informatic tools and new approaches, integrate this incredible ecosystem that we have of cores and other scientific resources across the university and nationwide, and then develop kind of the educational tools, resources, and others to move this thing forward. We do this when we think about it through three major pillars: to train and cultivate translational scientists to really be able to work together, to be able to move things forward, to enhance scientific innovation, and hopefully today we're going to continue to kind of fan the embers of that and thinking about how might we all work together as a scientific community, and then to innovate research processes, both to enhance quality, ethics, and efficiency, but also for methodologic development. That for us to be able to take the next kind of big leaps, we need to develop new methodologies, new ways to thinking, whether that's in study design or whether that's in fact in analysis or other types of programs, with the ultimate goal to create a sustainable environment, a sustainable collaborative group of individuals that move forward that can ultimately improve human health. So over the last almost 12 years, we're now in our third cycle of funding. So we're about a year and a half into our third cycle of funding. The NIH has supported the CCTS and the activities here across the Ohio State University with just under $100 million that have really been put into the hands of investigators to move forward and to really capitalize on these types of opportunities. One of the things that I hope that you'll have the opportunity during the meeting today and talking to individuals across the Center for Clinical and Translational Science are what are resources that are available through the CCTS that could help each and every one of you to follow kind of your area of inquiry, things that excite you about clinical and translational science. And one of those areas is our voucher program. So our voucher program, together with access to actual CCTS cores like biomedical informatics, study design through biostatistics, and others actually facilitated. So every faculty member at The Ohio State University that's engaged in clinical and translational science has the opportunity to actually apply for a voucher through the CCTS of $3,000 per year to actually be able to leverage the cores around here to move things forward for the development of pilot data, for example, for being able to submit a research project grant, for the completion of an additional aim or maybe an exploratory area that your research showed up, or to be able to answer that somebody who reviewed your manuscript and all of a sudden wants one more experiment, wants you now to do some proteomics or something like that you didn't originally have in your plans. Since the funding of the new grant, we've had more than an additional 200 publications that have cited direct support from the CCTS, which now brings our total to well over 1,600 to 1,800 publications and over 45,000 citations. So clearly driving the field of science moving forward. Over the past year, we funded more than 30 new teams under our pilot programs under 7 different pilot initiatives, and you'll hear again at 11:15 about a new pilot initiative that's directly focused on artificial intelligence and machine learning that I hope all of you will submit a letter of intent to and become active with. And then we have career development support, and over 11 faculty now have joined the 36 previous faculty who are KL2 scholars within the CCTS, an additional 7 pre- and postdoctoral trainees. are developing careers and learning the foundation of translational science. And certainly workshops, just in 2019, have had more than 600 people across the university attend. And towards the end of the day, we'll talk to you about several new workshops, including one that we're doing together with Technology Commercialization Office to really spur on innovation and entrepreneurship. But I think one of the most exciting things that we do is really in driving and enhancing trajectories and opportunities in new scientific initiatives. And we really do that kind of through a 4-step process in thinking things through. So we try to convene together a group of individuals to start to think about what might be an exciting opportunity that really leverages unique strengths at the university that we can pull together, not individuals in a single department, but to think broadly, bringing people together across multiple different colleges together to address major scientific areas. We then connect them together in meetings such as this in order to be able to start to percolate. So kind of that concept of stone soup, right? That you begin to bring together the components that becomes that secret sauce of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science. We catalyze the activities by actually offer pilots and other things to be able to move forward new teams to start to develop new methodologies, be able to apply those methodologies to other scientific questions, and allow this to move forward on a pathway of sustainable research, and then create enabling technologies that are shared that allow the field to begin to move forward, and that can be accessed by the broader scientific community, including your trainees, your graduate students, postdoctoral students, and other collaborators across. We started this in the past with comparative effectiveness research in our very first CCTS meeting. We moved forward to it in therapeutics development and the use of comparative translational animal models. Last year we brought together with the state and talked about teaming up to address some of the greatest state health priorities. And in this year, we're really tackling, I think, one of the incredible opportunities that we now have, which is how do we actually work with the massive amounts of big data that we now have to be able to get meaningful insights into human health. So one of the opportunities over the last decade has been that ability to go from relatively small science to big science. And as our computational approaches improve, as our ability to reach out to larger and larger populations, as multidimensional data, including things like the Human Genome Projects and omics, all the way to the biosensors and environmental sensors that we can collect for data, we're beginning now to have the opportunity to probe things in ways that we weren't able to do before. And so the ultimate goal of this is to take that data, move it forward to creating information that ultimately spurs on the creation of knowledge. And with time, and as we actually validate that knowledge, it becomes wisdom and ultimately changes the way that we approach health. And one of the opportunities to do this is to use new approaches. And I think that I'm certainly speaking to the choir here, is that AI isn't new. Artificial intelligence has been around now for certainly well over a decade, which is really harnessing the techniques and approaches using computers to actually more rapidly mimic human intelligence and to be able to start to create some meaning out of data. But that one can now build upon that and look at subsets of that data in ways for machine learning, and more importantly, where one begins now to use the machine to actually look for patterns and to be able to learn from data all the way to deep learning. And so what you're going to see over the course of the day is a number of different speakers, presentations, posters, and opportunities to think of how is this being applied, not only here at The Ohio State University and at Nationwide Children's, but what are some of the forefronts of AI and machine learning that we can take away, that we can think about applying to the questions that are the most meaningful to us, to our state, to our nation, and globally, and how can we contribute to that area. I think we're incredibly excited about the program we have for you today, and certainly I encourage you to be actively involved, engaged, ask questions, network, and talk to people. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Christopher Austin, who is the Institute Director for the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, who's really going to help to put in perspective where AI and machine learning and other initiatives at the NIH are actually working together to catalyze translational science innovation. And hopefully you'll get some insight into new areas, some funding opportunities, and some collaborative opportunities to actually work with intramural programs and other groups around the nation to actually move this thing forward. And part of that is that ability then to convene and connect together with institutions broadly across this country and globally to think about how we answer this. In our catalyzing of the activities today, we're going to talk to you further about the pilot funding mechanisms that are available for you to bring together new teams of investigators. So again, taking the opportunity to meet individuals here, to think about bringing together clinicians, public health individuals, basic scientists, computer scientists, biostatisticians, and computational biologists to think about that. And we'll give you additional information regarding how you access vouchers or apply for the pilot programs to support that. And then over the next several months, you'll see additional information about tools that are actually going to be widely available to you to help to support these efforts, including tools that will help you develop and find the expertise that's necessary to move forward your team science, AI toolkits, really leveraging things that are in multiple departments across, but bringing them together in a central repository so they're actually findable. And importantly, we know there's a tremendous amount of very high quality data, including electronic health record and other data here at The Ohio State University. We're currently actively involved in developing a shareable repository for that data. So basically a data enclave that will actually facilitate your access to data that will allow you to be effective. As I said, our program today, our keynote speaker is Dr. Christopher Austin from the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, but we also have a series of plenary talks from experts across the United States who are going to show you some of the areas where their own research has moved forward with application of AI and machine learning to look at ways, for example, to monitor mental health and performance, to look more deeply at genomics and phenotyping, and microelectronics together with AI. But we also think about the human side of this. What are the ethics associated with use of artificial intelligence? What are the things that we need to think about as we apply this in order to make sure that not only do we do rigorous science, but we do science that in fact is the most ethical and appropriate science in order to move forward. We invite you to go to the poster presentations this afternoon and spend time actually engaging with scientists across Ohio State and nationwide to see the types of activities that are moving forward, as well as to hear 3 invited oral presentations about activities that are ongoing. and then have an opportunity over lunch for facilitated table discussions around different topics. And so please find one of those rooms, go to them, be actively engaged. They're really there to start conversations, to find ways to move forward. It certainly doesn't cover all of the areas. They're just some of those that were brought forward to us as of areas of great interest, where we can begin to develop kind of communities of practice or communities of inquiry that might work together with all of this. I'd like to finish with what I think is critical for us to think about today, and that's, of course, the first step is working together as a team. So this meeting really, I think, very much embodies what Henry Ford said so eloquently in the past, and I always use for my final slide when I talk. Coming to this meeting, engaging today with your fellow scientists, coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. So developing those collaborations to start to move forward that can begin to advance science. But ultimately, working together is success. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take great advantage of the opportunities that are here to move forward your own kind of ideas. Reach out to any of us for the CCTS if you have questions. Thank you so much, and go Bucks, beat Wisconsin.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Good morning. So it is my extreme pleasure this morning to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Katharina Schultebraucks, who hails to us from Columbia University Data Science Institute and the Emergency Medicine Center of Excellence. Her research focuses on the study of longitudinal and prospective evaluations to identify complex sets of early predictors for stress pathology after traumatic events. And this morning, she's going to talk to us about machine learning and predicting and monitoring mental health and human performance. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Schultebraucks.
That's the wrong one. One moment. They have to find the right slides. It's mental health, predicting and monitoring, machine learning for predicting and monitoring mental health. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here and to speak about my research and how we can use machine learning to improve the prediction and monitoring of mental health and human performance. I jumped in for Isaac Gallagher-Levi. Most of you saw probably in the program that he should talk today, but he couldn't. And so I jumped in spontaneously. So I just give a short disclosure. I have no financial or professional conflict of interest. I only receive salary from Columbia University. And today I want to speak a little bit about stress pathologies and trauma and how we can use machine learning in this area. So traumatic events are quite often, about 70% of the population experience at some point in their life a traumatic event. And when we look, for example, here at the phases of and the reaction of those who are experience a traumatic event, we can see that the responses are biological hardwired. And this is important to help us to adapt to the threat and harm that these traumatic events are causing. And our body reacts in situations like that with a cascade of neuroendocrine response and also response of the neuroadrenergic system to help us to react to this traumatic event. But there are also like a lot of other factors who are influencing how we are reacting to it. Genetics, epigenetics play a role, and also previous traumatic events, just to name a few. But what I want to make clear is it's like a complex biological system that helps us to adapt to these traumatic events. And after a traumatic event, there are a lot of also changes also in the brain that also, and other biological consequences that you can see that influence also our circadian rhythm, later physiological response, and also brain aging, to name a few. And also we can see that in our daily functioning, in how we sleep, in our sleep and wake cycle, in later arousal and memory and cognitive functioning. So after a traumatic event, quite early, people are getting in contact with the medical system. So for example, after a motor vehicle accident, quite early you come into the emergency room, and physicians help you. The more severe, the less longer you have to wait to get help. And also, even when you are for example, in military personnel, even on the battlefield, there's quite early usually that there's a medical professional who help you with your injury. So, and we were very interested to see, these very early incidents, early after the traumatic event, if we can use the information, how people are reacting to the traumatic event to improve, to better understand who develop long-lasting stress pathologies, and also to maybe improve, to decrease the risk of long-lasting problems. So we had, at my time at NYU, together with Isaac Gallitzer-Levi, the Bellevue Stress and Resilience Study. It was a naturalistic prospective longitudinal study where we collected data in trauma survivors directly in the ED and followed them over 1 year. And we identified heterogeneous trajectories of stress response through this 1 year after the ED admission. And we were very interested, especially using the data collected in the ED if we can use that information to predict long-term stress pathology. So in the US, there are about 30 million discharges after potential traumatic event per year. And even when most of the participants are resilient and don't show any stress pathologies, there are about 10 to 20% who show long-lasting problems. So that's why we thought there's a significant unmet mental health problem. And so far, most of you know Ron Fisher, who famously is one of the godfathers of traditional statistics, who looked at to examine, for example, what the level of nitrate in the soil influence growth of plants. And I choose that as an example because many of these studies examining risk factors in stress pathologies looked at single factors and looked at mean difference of these factors. and to understand what is influencing the cause, what is influencing the development of, for example, PTSD. However, the clinical reality in psychiatry is way more complex, and we see that there are many influencing factors that play a role, and we have to think about other ways how we can capture these complex influences and these higher interactions of multiple risk factors. And that's why we thought that machine learning might be a tool to help us to disentangle the more complex interactions. I just quickly spoke about all the factors that are influencing the development of long-lasting stress pathologies. And interestingly, most of them are already routinely collected within the electronic medical records. So that's why we were very interested in using those information that are routinely collected in the ED. And to improve, so when you think about okay, there's a person coming to the ED after a traumatic event. We are right now not able to identify those who are at high risk to develop long-lasting stress pathologies. And the issue is that patients in the ED, that is usually the only contact they have with the medical system for a long time, and then after this they go home and don't come back only when they have more severe mental problems. So when we would be able to identify those at high risk early on when they are still in contact with the medical system, we think, and when we can develop and implement a validated prediction model, we can improve the success of early interventions and also avoid over-treatment with blanket interventions. And many studies have shown that there is a window of opportunities early after the traumatic event that has shown to be beneficial to reduce risk of psychiatric disorders. However, it has been shown that it's only beneficial for a small group of patients, those who are at high risk for developing long-lasting PTSD symptoms. So when we are able to, and we want to early intervene, then we have to identify those at high risk within the ED early on. And we thought, because we were very interested in develop an accurate but also scalable and cost-effective algorithm that has the chance to be implemented. And that's why we were very interested in using routinely collectible data, because I'm also working right now in the ED, and in the ED is a big problem, is the overcrowding. Even 10 years ago already, there was in the New England Journal and other big journals, they spoke about a crisis in the ED, that it's at the breaking point, and that they are not able to deal with more patients. But since then, it's getting more and more crowded, not less crowded. And it's really a problem that we cannot give the providers more things to do, like another questionnaire, another task they have to fill out. We need to use routinely collectible data to improve the prediction. So we collected data at two big level 1 trauma centers from the Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta and Bellevue Hospital in New York. We developed a model, predictive model, and captured PTSD symptoms throughout 12 months after ED admission. And then we built the model within the Grady, with the data of the Grady Memorial Hospital, and we tested it in an independent sample, those from Bellevue Hospital. And we could show that when we look at the model development and external validation, that we have similar good results with a precision of 0.86, recall of 0.85, and an AUC of 0.83 by just using the data collected in the ED, using the routinely collected data to predict the course over time with 12 months after ED admission. And we also looked at relevant features that are driving that. I don't want to go into detail with that, but what I want to show you, which is like, I don't know, what I want to show you is, this is like very often a question you have to deal with when you're using machine learning, and then people want to, what are the most important predictors? Then you give them the list, and then they say, oh, this is like the most important predictor, we look now at this factor. But when we look at the decision path, we can see that it's like an interaction of multiple factors. It is not only one factor who's driving the prediction. I think this is like very important also when we work with clinicians together. It is not look only at the most important predictor and then you can predict PTSD. No, it is like a complex interplay. That's why we used machine learning in the first place. And we found that early after the traumatic event, immediately when they came into the emergency room, that the immune response was very important, and also the physiological stress markers and also metabolic stress markers. So we found that markers that are associated with a high pathogenic and anxiogenic effects were related to higher risk of later develop long-lasting PTSD symptoms. And we were also interested in that only phenomenon that works in the US, because I'm from Europe, and so we looked also in Europe if that works too. So we had like a big multi-center study where we also collected data over 12 months after ED admission, and also there we were very interested in identifying heterogeneous responses to the traumatic event. So this is like a PTSD measure for PTSD symptoms, and you can see they are like very heterogeneous response. So we have those who have like long-lasting symptoms, we have those who have no symptoms at all after the traumatic event, so the traumatic event is here. And we have those who have symptoms but then decrease in symptoms, and we have those who develop later on PTSD symptoms. So this is like something we usually find in studies, and we were able to very accurately predict, when I can go back, this all differentiate all the 4 trajectories by only using the data collected in the ED, and also to predict PTSD diagnosis 12 months after ED admission. And also here, I just like want to quickly tell you why we were again interested in machine learning, not only because we had like a lot of data in the electronic medical records, but also when you look at the association of the outcome with the features, we usually see a more complex association, not just like a linear association. And I think this is like, again, an advantage of some machine learning models that are able to capture also more complex associations. And so from the first results I show you today, what we can see is there is probabilistic information in the ED available to predict long-lasting PTSD symptoms. And also that's why we use only routinely collectible data, because we were very interested if we can implement that in medical emergency systems. And of course, the algorithm we developed can be improved by using every new patient who's discharged from the emergency room to integrate it in our model. And we aim for that earlier, more targeted preventive strategies can be implemented, and also that this can be used to inform clinical decision making. But we have like a big problem in psychiatry and in mental health. So we have a big problem in defining our clinical phenotype. And when we, for example, look at when we look at PTSD, because this is like my research focus, we can see there like many different ways how a PTSD can manifest itself. So my colleague Isaac found that there are like 636,000 different ways how a PTSD can manifest itself. So the clinical phenotype is super heterogeneous. So we asked ourselves, and this is like a big debate in psychiatry, how can we get other measures of clinical functioning? How can we get more reliable, more efficient, more patient relevant, and more comprehensive and much easier available ways to define a clinical phenotype? And this is like a video with a patient who is coming to, it's like a training video, but this is like, I'm also a psychotherapist, it's a typical situation. You have a patient who's like speaking, and you have like the first interview where you ask, why are you here, and what brings you to it. When I'm, as a clinician, I'm looking also at the behavior of this patient to decide what kind of disorder this patient has. And also, like, for example, when we look at this patient, she has a major depressive disorder. We see like a lowered gaze, lack of eye contact. We see it in her facial expressivity. She shows slow movement, and when there would be a tone right now, we can also see it in the verbal valence and also the speech content. So what we can see is that behavior is indicative of clinical functioning, and all of her behavior allows me as a reviewer to assess her clinical state. So when we think about the patient, so this is like a typical regression equation, but what is driving my clinical phenotype? There are a lot of like factors who are driving it, genes, circuits, proteins, just to name a few. But the most important thing is what I want to discuss today is to define the clinical phenotype, because even when this is driving it, are we really good in defining the clinical phenotype? What is a phenotype? So a phenotype is a set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of this genotype with the environment. It is it's a clinical description. The phenotype is what you see. It is visible, an observable expression of the results of the gene combined with environmental influence. And for example, just like one example, you can see it, for example, on the color of the cat's hair or the sound of the birds chirping. And so when you think about like who was one of the first person who looked at phenotypes of behavioral and physiological phenotypes, this was Charles Darwin, who, for example, looked at different phenotypes in animals, but also at different facial expressions. And there is like, in the last years, especially by Tom Insel, the former NIMH director, who introduced the term digital phenotyping. Digital phenotyping is mainly like can be seen as like the interaction of a human being with the smartphone, or you can use the smartphone, and you can see, for example, when you type a text message, how fast you're typing, how many errors you are made, how you are swiping in your phone, but also all of our smartphones have a GPS sensor, so we can see the activation, like where is the person, is it only at home, is it like is this person like exploring a lot? But we can also use it for more active digital phenotypes using, for example, voice prosody, sentiment analysis, and coherence analysis, but also face analysis. And when you think about it, okay, most of us have a smartphone, I guess. So what is the last thing you do at night before you go to bed? You look at your phone. What is the first thing you do when you wake up? You look at your phone. What is when you cannot sleep? You look at your phone. So even like usual sleep patterns, you can kind of measure with like the smartphone use. And also, and that's why there's like a big movement in using the interaction of a person with a smartphone to also monitor mental health, and also, for example, after a treatment, to monitor if there's a relapse, etc. And when we go back to the pictures I showed in the beginning, the responses to a traumatic event, we were very interested in using these biological hardwired information and to capture that. And we made, like with our patients, a qualitative interview where we asked them emotion-provoking questions, and we captured a lot of markers, which I will now discuss in more detail. For example, we measured the facial features, like, for example, emotion expressivity, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, contempt, disgust, surprise, and composite. And when you see it, like the literature, there's like an increase in like published literature on, for example, depression, schizophrenia, cancer, Parkinson, Alzheimer's, heart disease, so across different disorders. And also we extracted voice features, for example, verbal features, expressivity, pitch, harmonic to noise ratio, and also speech features like the content valence, the speech rate, the intent, etc. And also here we can see an increase of published papers using verbal and speech features, and also to be able to distinguish specific populations from controls. And also we looked at movement in the video data we used. For example, the general body movement, tremor, and also variation in speech. And also here we see an increase in publications. And we also used our video information to track it for gaze tracking, so for eye tracking. And then, so we had this interview, we extracted those features, and then we built a predictive model and to see if we can use those features to distinguish people with PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms from those who don't have these symptoms. So those are like, so we had like 4 minutes, the participants had 4 minutes to respond to what brought you to the hospital, tell me more about the experience in the hospital, and tell me about the last month. So we made this interview in all those trauma survivors who were admitted to the ED after the traumatic event, and this interview we took 1 month after they were discharged from the ED. And then we made like an infrared pictures before and after each question to measure body temperature. And we were able to predict the different like trajectories of long-lasting symptom development. And also we looked at if we can use the facial features, the voice features, the movement features, and also the speech content to predict PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms, as to classify the diagnosis, and also to predict long-lasting symptoms. And we showed that we can also long-lasting, like over 12 months, non-remitting PTSD and also depression we can predict quite well. And we looked also at the features, and we can see that we also find like relevant features that we would also expect, like for example, more fear and anger expressivity in PTSD patients, less positive emotions, and more contempt expressivity in depressive patients. And we were also interested, besides the psychological state, if we can also identify cognitive performance by only using the face, voice, and speech and movement features. So we were able to quite good predict, like, sorry, this is very small, like motor coordination, emotion bias, processing speed, sustained attention, and flexibility, inhibition, executive functioning. So like different areas of cognitive functioning, we were quite good in like predicting the performance. And this is like I don't want to bother you with the most important questions, but so we can see what I showed you so far. Okay, there is like on the one hand enough like a lot of probabilistic information in the ED early after trauma to predict long-lasting information. We have a very good algorithm that is generalizable across different like samples. And also we could show, okay, we are able to use a different way of classifying psychopathology using different markers, voice, face, speech, content, and movement to predict psychological status and also cognitive functioning. But the most important thing is, because that is what I said to you before, I'm very interested, how can we make use of this data, our results, how can we make this actionable? And this is like a very important question. How can we scale up the clinical utility of this technology? And in recent years, there are a lot of like ways they try to do that and to implement, for example, mobile devices in health systems, or also like the NYU that was recently published in New England Journal had like a learning health system that implemented in the electronic medical records to give physicians feedback on how to treat these patients. And also the VA is trying to improve that. But to implement that, there are like a lot of questions, for example, also at what time point we implement that. So when the traumatic event happens, or when they first get into contact with the healthcare system, or for example, using the electronic medical records, and or later on in the, for example, outpatient clinic. And also there's like another big problem. Stakeholder engagement is crucial to success. So we see there are a lot of different stakeholders we have to think about. Like, okay, there's the research side, which is like, for example, me, but there's also like the provider side, the payer side, the treatment developers, the hospital systems, the patients who have their own opinion and what they want, the government, hospital system, technology developers, just to name a few. So it's a complex, like, stakeholder discussion we need to think about and to also already think about during our research to better make our research also actionable and later usable. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Yeah. So voice prosody, that's, so there are like different factors we are measuring. We are measuring, for example, the pitch. So the difference in the pitch. And also glottal to noise ratio, and also like these are like really like how you, for example, pronounce that, like the higher of your voice, and these are like voice prosody. And the content is really more, okay, what kind of words am I using? There's like, we are using natural language processing, like how many, there's a sentiment analysis, so for example, how many positive, negative, neutral words, how many like word repetition we have, and there like it's like a long list, but it's really more how we say things, how often do we say things, yeah. No, I'm more from the research side. Now we did, like my colleague Isaac Galitza-Levi started to do that because he's now moved from academia to industry, and they are doing it. I'm very interested in doing that to also see how, because there it's more complex than in a research setting, because we saw that when I worked with colleagues together who are doing it, for example, you are questioning these patients, and not every patient is sitting in a quiet room. Some of them are, for example, doing that in the subway. Then you have the back noise. But we are quite good in reducing the noise in the data and capturing the signal. So the most important thing is, and this is really like a problem to, that's why I said like the stakeholder problem, to motivate patients to do this every day or however like what you want from them. Because this is like they go home and then they have their everyday life, and they motivate them to do it in their private life. This is like really a problem. And I can see that with many colleagues who are doing that. But I think there are ways, and that's why we are looking more, okay, how short you can, for example, have the questions, that they don't have to spend much time in doing that, and how that it's more implementable in their everyday life.
Thank you for your talk.
Can I point out, we've got, just for folks, we've got some microphones on both ends of the room, so if you have a question, if you could come to the mic so everybody else could hear it, that'd be great.
Could I ask you about your data collection system, the motor and the facial? What did you use to collect those data?
Sorry, can you repeat?
For the facial recognition and the movement quantification, what collection system did you use to collect those data?
So, as I said, we did it in an experiment. So they answered the question. We had a camera, which they captured it, and then, do you mean how we processed the data?
Was it a strictly RGB camera, or did you use a infrared camera? The actual physical?
It was a normal camera. We also used the infrared camera. That was a specific camera for the infrared pictures, yes. But for the interview, we used a normal camera, like a normal at that time, the highest resolution camera that was available. But we also, for example, analyzed that data using extracted features in survivors of 9/11, where we had a really, really bad quality of camera, because at that time we didn't have there were not that high resolution cameras, and you can extract that signal there too.
Okay, and how did you extract it? I guess I'm getting at what features you used.
So we extracted the features I presented. So how we did that. So there are like a lot of so because we of course don't have in clinical context that big sample size, so we use pre-trained neural nets. There are a lot of, even when you are interested in doing that, there are even a lot of open source, for example in Python, Parthel mouse for extracting voice features, which is like quite good. And so we extracted those features by using also open source software, because we wanted to make it also usable in the scientific community. So in our paper, we describe that very well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Did you look at cultural differences in precision of prediction?
Yes, we looked at in the voice. You mean in the facial features? Yes.
Really in all of it.
In all of it. So in the ED, yes, and that's why we were very glad, because we had, for example, in the Grady sample, we had like more Hispanic, way more Hispanic and Black patients than in New York in the Bellevue sample. And despite the differences, we were similar good in predicting it, even when we have like heterogeneous, completely different samples. We were very proud of it. And also we had patients we know that especially, and this is like a really big debate in the facial and voice features, that there are like biases and that there is not enough data, especially in the pre-trained neural net, like in other non-white participants. We were quite good in identifying those, but this is like a big problem, and the community tries to deal with it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Stephen Kaler, Nationwide Children's Hospital. So that was a lovely and fascinating talk. And obviously this is human subjects research, and I wondered,
Yes.
how did you approach the informed consent process? And then another question was related to the prospective nature of these interviews, and whether you aim to use these as predictors of certain risks, suicide, for instance,
Yes.
or other.
So how did we approach it? So is a real world sample. So those patients were really like admitted to the ED. And so we had like a lot of inclusion, exclusion criteria. So for example, we excluded those who were not able to give informed consent. So we got information from the whiteboard, like directly from the surgeons when we knew, and the ED physicians when we knew patients came in. And then we had a whole battery of colleagues who then went down into the ED, and when the patients were reachable, we reached them and asked them if they are okay. But then we reached out to them 7 days after again and asked them again if they are really still okay with that. Because of course, when they are in the ED, it's like a very stressful event, and so we just like told them about the study and if we can contact them in 7 days, and then we reached out after 7 days again to ask them if they are still willing to participate. And yes, and the extracted features, yes, we are interested, and we use them as predictors, as I said, for predicting depression and PTSD. Suicidality, not, so predicting suicidality is like, it would be great if we are very accurate with it, but it's also a big problem in psychiatry to really accurately predict it. And also the number of participants who have suicide ideations and commit suicide is quite low. So we didn't look at this in that sample, but it's a very important point to look at.
There was actually a poster at the Nationwide Research Institute retreat held here about 10 days ago, at which someone from the Behavioral Health Institute used review of medical records from providers using like word choices, trying to develop based on the wordage used in the medical records as predictors of depression and suicide.
Yeah, I know there's like a lot of like, Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is John Thompson with OSUMC Custom Software, and I just wanted to know if the trained modules, if you're planning to make those available.
Yes, we are willing to make them available, yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Jennifer Garvin from Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. I wondered, what is your reference standard? So you provided the diagnosis, and how did you establish a reference standard to determine that these were accurately predicted?
So, what do you mean? If we, how can we say? We didn't give, for example, we had like this external validation set where it was unlabeled, but we could compare it with the labels later on. So we know we know, but the model doesn't know if those patients had PTSD or depression. And so we can compare what the model is saying, that they have depression or PTSD, and we can compare it if they actually, what is their actually diagnosis? Is that your question?
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is that you had subject matter experts to actually determine if these patients had this condition.
Yes.
And then you compared your predictive model to that.
Yes.
And did you have subject matter experts that were from around the world, from all of your sites?
Yes.
To determine, okay. So you had psychologists and psychiatrists determine the diagnosis and then compare these predictive models?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Schultebraucks? Thank you.
Speak. Are we hearing this? Okay. Our next speaker is Melissa Goldstein, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Milken Institute of Public Health at the George Washington University, where she teaches courses in bioethics, including genomics, privacy, reproductive ethics, end of life, and research ethics issues, health information technology policy, and public health law, and conducts research on health information privacy and the legal and policy aspects of health information technology. Professor Goldstein's recent research and writings have focused on privacy and security issues in health information exchange and the use of big data, as well as the effects of health information technology on the physician-patient relationship and patient engagement. During the 2010-2011 academic year, Professor Goldstein served as a senior advisor to the Chief Privacy Officer in the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Professor Goldstein also served as the Assistant Director for Bioethics and Privacy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy during the final year of the Obama administration. So with that, we'll bring Dr. Goldstein.
Good morning. This is my first time at the Ohio State University. Thank you for inviting me. As I was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and a lifetime Alabama fan, I am most comfortable when I'm visiting places with football teams in the college playoffs. It doesn't look like we're going to make it this year, but I think you guys are. My specialty, as Carolyn just mentioned, is in ethics and privacy. I'll be talking a little bit about some ethical issues in artificial intelligence, and I'll be talking about some principles that you're probably familiar with, some that you might not have thought about before, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions and answers. As you can see, well, in the program you'll see I am a lawyer, which by training, I was an ethicist first. I don't actually practice law now, I'm in academics, but what it means when you see a JD after someone's name is that we don't have pictures in our slides because we don't know how to do that. So my slides will be all words. I apologize in advance if you would prefer pictures, but I just don't know how to do that on PowerPoint. Okay. So some of the issues that we confront in this area, you've heard about. Scandals, covered in the press widely, covered, on Twitter, covered on Facebook. Facebook covers its own, scandals, right? Cambridge Analytica, the scraping technology. An issue of Google employee protests over military contracts, where many Google employees were very upset and actually I'm not sure if it was an official strike, but they were objecting to military contracts where they were going to be building essentially an artificial intelligence system. Then we have biased algorithms in Amazon's hiring processes, where a study was done that said that the processes themselves, the statistical analysis, the data analytics, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, were actually working systematically against the hiring of women without intention. So the idea of unintended consequences from algorithms, from statistical analysis done by computers essentially, raises issues of possible discrimination, whether unintentional or intentional. And then lots and lots and lots of articles in the New York Times. There's one even more recent than this one, but this is a quote I particularly liked: "Artificial intelligence has a trust problem." So this is a New York Times op-ed from September of this year. So what I'd like to talk about, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about data analytics, and then we'll get into some basic ethical principles that I've grown up with and been teaching for my career in specifically bioethics. So healthcare ethics, medical ethics, bioethics is a much broader term that might also include environmental ethics, privacy principles, privacy ideas, privacy in law, and then finally, specific AI principles guidelines. I'm going to talk about a couple of inventories that have been done in the past 2 years over basically 80 plus frameworks, most of which have been developed in 2018 and 2019, very, very recently. So these overviews have studied commonalities among the frameworks that have been developed in the private sector, in the public sector, among institutions, organizations such as nonprofit organizations and universities in general, and what the similarities are among all of these frameworks that are being developed, what the differences are, and then ultimately, do they have any bite, as we might call it, in the law? So first, data analytics. When I was in the White House at the end of the Obama administration, we talked a lot about data ethics and big data. Now the conversation has moved on to artificial intelligence, machine learning. What do we do with this data? But it all relies upon big data, which the previous speaker has spoken about as well. So I think today you're going to be talking a lot about big data, but you'll also be talking about its use in AI. So big data. Data analytics, of course, has both opportunities, amazing opportunities, mind-blowing opportunities, but there are also risks. And what I think about, what my colleagues talk about, are how do we define these risks, how do we find them, and then what do we do about them? So a few particular risks. Privacy risks, which you may or may not have already talked about a lot in your particular fields, but also civil rights, which is, as an attorney, and basically as a civil rights attorney, we think about ideas in civil rights, opportunities and discrimination issues in employment, in availability of housing, things like that. Responsible and ethical use of data. At the end of my talk today, I'm going to talk about these AI principles and guidelines that talk about responsibility. What does that mean? Responsibility of computer scientists, responsibility of researchers, and ethical use of data. What these overviews have found is that everyone says that we should use data ethically. All of the frameworks, pretty much everyone you talk to, yes, of course we should do it ethically. But nobody really defines what that means. And if we define what that means, we don't necessarily know how to operationalize it. One of the problems is that it's complex and difficult to understand. So when we're talking to the public, some of us may even have trouble translating what the problems are to the public. These are difficult concepts. Some of it is very difficult statistically. How do you explain to my mother, for example, what an algorithm is. I'd like to give you guys this job because I can't do it very well, right? And it also can make it hard to know when one's privacy is violated or if you've been the subject of unfair bias. Do you think if you all looked into the algorithms of, say, what opportunities for housing or what houses are presented to you in a particular search, would you know if you have been the person who has been open to unfair bias? When you are given opportunities in perhaps a employment database or an employment search on, I'm trying to think what my students use, what the name of it is for nonprofits. I can't think of it right now. But if you search for issues and you put in what your demographics, do you know if you're seeing employment opportunities that should be shown to everybody, or are they just shown to you because of your zip code, because of where you currently live, because of the content of your household right now? How many people? Are you in an apartment? Are you an owner? Are you not an owner? How do you know when you're the subject of unfair bias? And if people in this group, and I bet there are a few of us, if people in this group don't know when we're the subject of unfair bias, how do we expect other people to know this? The basic idea here is that intentional or implicit biases may emerge from the data itself, either what we put into the system, because we are human, or the algorithms. So decisions based on these systems can affect our lives, whether or not we qualify for credit or employment opportunities. Do you get all those things in the mail asking you to get credit cards anymore? I do, sometimes. I don't get as many as I used to. When I was at a law firm, for instance, right? Where does that information come from? Which financial, employment, and housing advertisements do we see? And then the big bird here we talk about is transparency. If institutions, if organizations put out their algorithms, that might be transparency, right? So that the computer scientists, the statisticians among you can actually dig around and study their algorithms. This is one of the ideas. If you are able to look at it and to dissect the algorithm, which of course I would never be able to do, will we know why the results come out the way they are? It's thought to be a step in the right direction, transparency in algorithms, but it won't help me. So then I am relying on you to help me and to interpret it and to publish it in a way that I will see, which may not be a peer-reviewed article, because I may not be one of the people that reads peer-reviewed article in computer science literature, right? So then how do we tell the public what's happening in this algorithm? Do we go to the New York Times, to USA Today, to tweets? What do we do at that point? Here's the challenge. So these two quotes are from the data discrimination white paper put out by the White House in 2016. I've got the URL down here. First one, potential to increase access to opportunity and help overcome discrimination. By actually using big data, we could overcome discrimination by putting more sources of data in about more people so that it's not just skewed to the affluent, right? If fairness in computational systems and ethical approaches to data analytics are the norm. However, the flip side of the coin, risks that these innovations could perpetuate discrimination and unequal access to opportunity as the use of data expands. So what do we do? I suspect that many of you have heard this term before, equal opportunity by design. Designing the systems from the beginning so that we take account of who is represented, different types of thinking that are represented, different types of people, different classes, different colors of people, different segments of society, different geographies. Designing data systems that promote fairness and safeguard against discrimination from the first step of the engineering process and continuing throughout the lifespan of whatever program it is that we're talking about. Bias mitigation, and then avoiding data fundamentalism. How many of you think of yourselves as a data fundamentalist? It's all in the data. We have to have the data. Trust the data. We love data. It's all about the data. But is it all about the data? Do we believe it's only about the data? And who does the data represent? When we think about data ethics, we use the term data are people, because the data represents us. It represents our mental health status, our biological health status. So if you think of data, each data point perhaps representing a person, if you put a face to it, if you put a name to it, this is where we get the ideas of honoring the data, honoring where the data comes from. The data, unless it's a dummy data set that doesn't actually represent people at all, represents us. Everyone in this room, all of our families, all of our students, all of our colleagues, some of whom are ill, some of whom have very difficult lives. Data are people. So if we think of it as avoiding data fundamentalism, as just thinking of it as data, perhaps we can move forward to equality, equal opportunity by design. So now I'm going to move into what we call the principles of biomedical ethics. There are lots of different ways to describe these. I'm going to talk to you about the big four, which have been criticized, of course, because, you know, ethicists criticize everything, including what we talk about, right? So, including our own. But I learned from James Childress and Tom Beecham, basically principlism, and I interpret from there. One of the most important things to remember about ethics analysis, however, is that it is all based on context, all based on particular facts. You cannot do an ethical analysis unless you know what you're talking about, unless you have a case history, unless you have cases in front of you. It's very similar to law, actually, in that way. A law, in the abstract, means essentially nothing to people who are trying to interpret it. You need facts. You need, as my mom would say, who shot Bob, right? That's what you need. How do I define ethics? So this is a quote from one of the textbooks I use in my courses, but I've doctored it a little bit. The study of morality using the tools and methods of philosophy, to which I add law, policy, and religious tenets. Because I think to me, if you think of it as philosophy only, it's up here, it's abstract. I add law, I add policy, because those are the things that I think about a lot, and I believe that ethics needs to be thought about, at least in these conversations, as part of law, as the basis of law, the basis of policy. But I also add religious tenets, and that means everyone's religious tenets, and how each of us interprets particular issues. So my ethics courses were in a comparative religion department, and then later on, when I did a postdoc, philosophy departments as well. I didn't have a natural affinity for the philosophical discussions as much as I did for the law and the religious-based, because I found that the law, the religious-based actually incorporate more emotion than purely philosophical arguments and logic did for me. But the reason why I have doctored this particular definition is because I think that it requires all of it, that we think from who we are. That's how we think. Different types. Applied ethics, that's what we're doing now. Use of moral norms and concepts to resolve practical moral issues. Issues in practice. What are we actually doing? What are we thinking about? Bioethics, applied ethics focused on healthcare, medical research, medical technology. Organizational ethics I'm going to talk about a little bit more because of these frameworks and guidelines in AI that have been developing in particular organizations. And sometimes these frameworks are being developed by one organization, and then what that organization does is they ask other organizations or individuals to sign on to the frameworks. You've probably seen them. You might have received them in your email, right? Please read this framework on ethics use in AI, and if you like it, please sign on to it. I get them all of the time in like Twitter from different colleagues and in email and things like that. Will you sign on to this framework? Organizational ethics. Focused on the character traits, rights, values, and duties expressed in the following formats, among others. How many of you have ever worked on a mission statement? In a faculty meeting for your department? In a strategic planning session for your school? In a strategic planning for the university? It seems like there's always some kind of strategic planning for something where we have to rewrite the same mission statement over and over and over again. And in a department with a lot of lawyers, can you imagine how many commas we move and whether we italicize them or not, and whether we're using the Oxford comma or not? It could drive you crazy. It drives me crazy. But the point of mission statements is supposed to mean something to all of us. What is the mission of the organization? What are our goals? What are our values? Where are we headed? Do we do this but not this? Are we meant to do this but not this? The mission statement. Policies and administrative practices. So I'm on the ethics committee in GW Hospital, and we have a binder of ethics policies basically for use in the hospital and the ambulatory center. I'm sure you have binders too with like policies, administrative practices. Generally, we call these policies with a little p, where, say, the policy of the state or the policy of the United States might have a big P policy, right? Little p policies for your own organization in that big binder. And then they rewrite it, and then you have to replace it in your binder. These days, there are electronic binders. I'm still paper-based, as you might imagine. Business priorities. So, Google's framework of AI ethics. Does it reflect Google's business priorities? What's your bet? Facebook's framework for AI ethics. Does it reflect Facebook's business priorities? You want to bet on that? The yes, the no there. Business priorities and organizational ethics. I'm not picking on them. I'm just pointing out that these are things that we need to think about when we read these particular statements and expect it's reality. We want them to have business priorities. We want innovation. We want these amazing startups that somehow have infiltrate our lives and are very useful to us. How else would I see my friends' baby pictures? And perhaps even more importantly, puppy pictures, right? How else would I see them except on Facebook, which is one of the reasons why, as a very privacy-focused individual, I have not yet deleted Facebook. Whereas a lot of people I know have, they're able to separate themselves and withdraw from the puppy pictures. I am not there yet. Perhaps I will get there. Moral principles. For my undergraduate class, I always ask them to come up with an absolute principle. Absolute principles with absolutely no exceptions. The first one they come up with is do not kill. And then, of course, someone else is like, well, what about euthanasia when it's justified? What about physician-assisted suicide when it's justified? What about capital punishment, whether we believe in it or not? So absolute principles are absolute. That's what they mean, although they're very difficult to find. Very difficult. We can. That's what they mean. They're absolute, no exceptions. Compared to prima facie principles, which essentially mean they apply in all cases. They're strong. They stand there. They are prima facie principles up to when they are compared with another one. another prima facie principle. And at that point, you have to think about the issues concerned here and the issues concerned here. Not necessarily, you'll often hear the term balance. By balance, we don't mean balanced against each other, that one wins and one loses. By balance, we mean both matter. And we have to think about them in a particular context to decide which one matters the most and how do we account for both issues in one particular contextual situation. What are these moral principles that I'm going to talk about? And I call these guys the big four. Autonomy, which comes from respect for persons. Non-maleficence, don't do bad. The flip side, beneficence, do good. And then justice. And here we mean justice is fairness, justice in terms of distribution of benefits and burdens across society, not just resting on one segment of society. First, autonomy. A person's rational capacity for self-governance or self-determination. Autonomy, I'm the boss of me. Oops, that was loud, sorry. You are the boss of you. Keep your laws off my body. Autonomy is bumper sticker worthy, right? Autonomy. I make my own decisions. Of course, that assumes that I have rational capacity to do that, and until I drink a couple cups of coffee in the morning, I may not actually be that autonomous individual, able to make decisions for myself. Autonomy principle. Autonomous persons should be allowed to exercise their capacity for self-determination. This is a prima facie principle. Some people think of it as more of an absolute principle, but you see in the balancing in particular issues, it's not the only thing that matters. It absolutely does matter, and it absolutely does matter in our law, and in public health, and in AI, and in data analytics, but it is not the only principle that matters. Autonomy comes from respect for persons. It's a more general umbrella term. Act so as to treat humanity in every case as an end and never as a means only. We are never going to use you only for the purpose of someone else. This comes from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. Incorporates at least two ethical convictions. Individuals should be treating each one as autonomous agent, and if you cannot act as an autonomous agent for whatever reason, for disability, for mental disability, for physical disability and mental disability. Here we're mainly talking about mental disability. Physical disabilities may include mental disabilities, but a physical disability alone does not take away your autonomy to make medical decisions. Persons with diminished autonomy and thus in need of protection are entitled to such protection. It is our duty to protect those individuals and speak on their behalf as they would speak for themselves. Substituted judgment. Next, beneficence. First, above all, do no harm. You know this, Hippocratic Oath. Two general rules. Don't do harm, maximize possible benefits, minimize possible harms. So do good, beneficence. Above all, do no harm, non-maleficence. And justice. I've thrown up a couple of particular ideas of the principle of justice here just to give you a little bit more of a full idea of what it means. Distributed. Justice regarding the fair distribution of society's advantages and disadvantages. Not all of the advantages here on this group, all of the disadvantages here on this group. We're not great at that in this country, in this world, but particularly in this country. We're not so great at this. Egalitarian theories of justice. Doctrines affirming that important benefits and burdens of society should be distributed equally. Equally. You got a pie. Many of you had pies over Thanksgiving, I'm assuming. Perhaps all of you had pies, right? You cut each piece absolutely equally, and each person gets an equal slice of the pie. But what if you've got a diabetic? What if you've got a really hungry person? What if you've got, let's see, kids in there, kids who are not yet 1, who you don't want to overload with sugar? And what if you have, the birthday boy who wants an extra big piece of pie? Is it perfect if each size is exactly the same? Do we prefer equally? The idea here is that equality is an easier measure, frankly, than equity. Those of you in public health no doubt have seen the picture of the kids trying to see over the fence. And the shortest kid, and of course I'm always the shortest kid, gets this little stool, and you know what? I still can't see over the fence. There's still like this much before I get to the fence. So you give everybody this equal stool. You've got the tall people who can see over the fence to begin with. You've got the medium kid who can see over the fence with the stool, and you've got the short kid, me, who still can't see over the fence. That's equality. We've all got the same stool. Equity, however, the tall kid doesn't need a stool at all. The middle kid just needs that short stool, but I needed the 3-stair ladder to reach the highest cabinets in my apartment. I need more. That is an achievement of equity. And when we define things in society, do we account for that? Or do we focus on equality? And what do we want? What is our preferred strategy? If we think everybody should get the same thing, that means equality. These are the issues that we have to decide. Libertarian theories, of course, have a little bit of a different idea. Libertarian theories, doctrines holding that the benefits and burdens of society should be distributed through the fair workings of a free market and the exercise of liberty rights of non-interference. The big questions here that we have to decide for ourselves are, do we have a free market in this country, in the world, anywhere? And if we have a free market, does it work fairly? Do we have the fair workings? Does that exist in reality or in an ideal only? And what do we do about it if it's an ideal? How do we reach it? And then finally, utilitarian theories of justice. This is essentially how we work public policy. Utilitarian, what's the best for the best number of people? How do we achieve the greatest good for the greatest number? So public policy and public health. We're looking for population level positivity. However, this always means that there are some individuals who will not be receiving that highest benefit. How do we assimilate them into society, and how do we make it better for them, or as good as we possibly can, if we are working from a public policy or public health goals from a utilitarian ideal? Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit more about organizational codes of ethics before we get into the AI idea. Define appropriate and inappropriate conduct within the workplace. Identify conduct that falls between those poles. Protect organizations from legal entanglements and employees from harassment and unfair treatment. This is my least favorite bullet in my slide deck today. I don't like focusing so much on the law. I don't want it to be our sole focus. But the reality of organizational codes of ethics is that the organization is hoping that it will solve some problems later. The goal to me would be treating people fairly, therefore we don't have conflicts later. That would be my greater goal. This one's a big deal here. Leaders should support, let me get the little green guy go. Leaders should support the code of ethics and should educate themselves and others about its application of benefits. Think about your own organizations and whether the leaders actually know the code and support it. What do you think? Could they do better? And then finally, mechanisms to monitor employee adherence to the code must be developed. Oh, that was a lower level employee who did that. Oh, that was a guy who nobody was watching who did that. The rogue employee, the person we never thought about. Well, who was his supervisor? Who was that person's supervisor? Do you hold responsibility for this? Or, is it each man for himself or each woman for herself within this organization? What's the accountability of this code? What's this accountability of this mission statement? Does it exist? If there's no accountability, why do we even have the mission statement? Why do we even have the code? What does it mean if we're not going to do anything with it once it exists? All right, another dramatic shift in what we're going to talk about today, privacy. And here I'm speaking specifically about health information privacy. And that includes the research context. What's at stake? Why do we care? Who cares? Does everyone care? How do we define it? What does it mean? And what is different in a networked environment? 15 years ago when I would talk about it, networked meant something different than it means today, right? I didn't even have an iPhone yet then. 15 years ago, none of us had iPhones, right? What was life like then? What did networked environment mean then? What does it mean today? What does it mean? People have different ideas when we think about privacy, and how do we define it? So some people think of it as the right to control your own health information. Not ownership here, the right to control. And this is how I think about it. Other people think about it as confidentiality, which is privacy within a specific legal relationship. This, confidentiality, is a specific legal relationship. So, doctor-patient, attorney-client, accountant-client. Did you guys know that there's a confidentiality relationship there? Psychiatrist, patient. Confidentiality between two people where there's a particular relationship. Confidentiality is not the same as privacy. Privacy is the umbrella term. And then finally, security. Safeguards placed on health information. This could range. You guys are much more versed in this, I'm sure, than I am. This could range from that little TSA-approved lock that's on my suitcase, right? Not a lot of security, to multi-factor authentication and very complicated encryption. Security in the HIPAA rule, in the HIPAA privacy rule, for example, is a scalable idea. The more advanced your data systems, the more complicated and secure your methods of protecting that data must be. When we are talking about ideas of identifiable information in precision medicine databases, for example, that requires a lot of security. When we're talking about a psychologist's office who has never moved away from paper, we're talking about a locked office, locked filing cabinets, that end of the scale. Privacy. We think of it as a basic human right. It's present in human rights conventions, documents. It's also thought of as both a negative and a positive right. Let's start with the negative right. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Negative right. Stay away from me. Keep your laws off my body. A negative right. I have my privacy, so you stay away from me. No state shall abridge the privileges and immunities of the United States. What cannot happen to us, as opposed to a privacy right, a positive right. I can control access to my information. I decide which doctor receives my podiatry reports. I decide which doctor receives my cancer diagnosis or my genetic code. I decide. Privacy, positive control versus privacy negative control. Stay away. And then finally, it's a right protected by common law, which is the cases that are written by judges, by the Supreme Court. By the US Constitution, there is a limited health information privacy right that is protected by the US Constitution and by state constitutions, the Ohio State Constitution, the Alabama State Constitution, the Colorado State Constitutions. State constitutions vary in a way that the US Constitution does not. Privacy is protected on all of these levels, but again, it is not an absolute right either. It is not an absolute principle either. Why do we care? It's grounded in the principle of respect for persons, which we talked about a few minutes ago, autonomy, but it's also grounded in this idea of the rule of fidelity. What does that mean? Fidelity, promise keeping, loyalty, faithfulness in the healthcare provider-patient relationship. And remember that first quote from the New York Times that I started talking about? Trust, fidelity, keeping our promises, doing what we say we're going to do, not doing other things that we said we were not going to do. Fidelity. Health information, we talk about as a little bit different than financial information. So financial information, your credit card, we pay now with the chip, we can pay now with Apple Pay, we can get money from the ATM, we can check our balances. The idea is that financial information can be replaced. If I take $10,000 from you wrongly, hopefully you can get that $10,000 back. It might be a pain in the neck. You might have to go through legal processes, but if I spew your HIV diagnosis all over Twitter, can't get it back. Over. Everybody knows, everybody's gonna know, you can't take it back. It's out there. If it's fake news, if it's false, you're still going to have as much trouble retracting that information because it's already out there. Embarrassment, I come from a small town. Everybody knows everything about everybody. Within a university community, within a department, how much information do you know about other people that you shouldn't know? Embarrassment, stigma, and then this evil one, discrimination in employment, insurance, government programs, benefits. We do have some protective statutes, federally and in states, but they are not comprehensive. This can still happen. Ultimately, distinction between personal data and healthcare data has become blurry. This is part of the big data reports that came out of the White House about fairness of big data. The idea is that health data used to be health data and financial data used to be financial data, but then at some point in between, I started getting, because I take metformin, I started getting catalogs for plus-size women, which doesn't fit exactly, right? And because I take Depakote to prevent my migraines, I started getting catalogs for mental health facilities, because Depakote can also be used for neurological issues and for psychiatric issues, right? So health information somehow ended up becoming financial information, ended up into marketing. It's blurry now. We don't have these neat categories anymore. Privacy and health general. What are we worried about in actual clinical context, from the privacy context, and what are we worried about in a public health context? We're worried that people won't show up because they're worried about privacy violations. We're worried that they're not going to come into the office for the mental health treatment they need because they're worried that it's going to get out. How many of you have friends who should have gone to counseling but don't want to because they don't want anybody to know? Or maybe they don't put it into they don't send it to their insurance company because they don't want people to know. They don't want the employer to know. They don't want other family members to know, right? But those people aren't getting the treatment they need. We want them to come into treatment. We want that incentive. And what about from a public health perspective? What if the guy with TB doesn't go into the doctor because he doesn't want to, be watched every day while he takes his pills, and he knows that that's a situation in New York is going to happen to him. He's going to end up in directly observed therapy. Then you know what? That guy still got TB, and he's out in the middle of New York. That's not what we want from a public health perspective, but that's a system where it's actually a risk. And we need to make sure it's on us. We have to protect them. And again, privacy in networked environments. So now we all know the concept of metadata. But then, when did you learn that phrase, metadata? Undergraduate? Graduate school? Postgrad? While you're working as a faculty member? Data shadow, increased risks of misuse of data, using it wrongly or in ways that we said we wouldn't use it, increased risks of reuse of data, secondary use, you all know that term, and basically it demands a systemized privacy protection based upon the fair information practice principles to reduce risks and establish trust. So what we're saying here is that because of the network environments, we now really require a systemic change. We require protections based on many, many different levels. So the fair information practice principles essentially were developed at the beginning of the 1970s by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now HHS, Labor Department. They've been all separated in the US, but they've been used internationally also. The exact iterations can vary depending on what department puts it out, what organization puts it out, but they're all kind of basically the same. And this is the one that I use because I worked at the Markle Foundation and I liked this graph. This is my one picture, so be proud of me here, okay? So I worked at the Markle Foundation in the mid-2000s, and this is the graph that we use. The idea behind this is that each bubble is incredibly important all by itself, but the strength of the whole is the most important thing. And you are going to have a stronger system of protecting privacy if you include all of the elements, because the whole is stronger, better than, and more complete than each part. It includes ideas such as individual participation and control, what we think of as consent, positive privacy. It also includes openness, transparency, telling people about our algorithms, what do they say, but also purpose specification, what I'm going to do with your data when I collect your data, and then collection limitation. I'm only going to collect the data I need. If I don't need your whole genome, I'm not going to take your whole genome. And then use limitation. This is that fidelity issue, trust issue. I said I was going to do this, I collected that, and you know what? I'm only going to do what I said I'm going to do. I'm not doing other stuff, even though it might make me more money, even though I might then have more data. I'm only going to do it if I go back to you and I ask you again, with some variations when we talk about aggregate data and broad consent at the beginning of an interaction, things like this, right? But from the outset, I am not going to do anything I told you I wasn't going to do without more, without another conversation. Data integrity, that dirty data issue. I don't actually have HIV. Why does the whole world think I have HIV? Security, again, physical security, encryption security, accountability, look at that one. If somebody breaches it, who's accountable? Where does the buck fall? Remedies, what happens if my stuff is breached? What then do I get? How many of you have like data, my identity was breached, kind of data protection services now, credit protection services? I do, because I was a federal employee and something, like I've been breached 100 times, right? Like, I don't think any password, whatever, right? Like, it's like OPM, I have this free credit reporting, that free credit reporting. I can't even keep up with my credit reporting now, right? So, but remedies, that's supposed to fix it. The $125 from Equifax, that's supposed to fix it. Did any of you get the $125 from Equifax? I haven't yet heard of a person who actually got the $125 from Equifax, but that's the idea. So remember this, reward me for my picture, strength of the whole. All right, the slide's just supposed to scare you, essentially, right? Non-lawyers. Do I have any other lawyers in here to make me, to be my friend? All right, it's supposed to scare you. There is a whole lot of law around health information privacy. Some people proudly say it's the most regulated segment of society. I'm not so proud about that, but what are you gonna do? All right, US Constitution, we talked about that. HIPAA, you've all heard about. Privacy Act of 1974, that's data that the government holds about you. Federal regulation, oops. Does that go back? Yep, federal regulations for the protection of human research subjects. That's the common rule. That's IRBs. State laws, special status for certain diseases, drug and alcohol treatment. This is for federally assisted drug and alcohol treatment. HIV/AIDS, genetic conditions. New York and California and many other states actually have special laws for HIV information, genetic information. More law, look at that, more law. mHealth, mobile health, the Apple Watch on your hand, your Fitbit, which Google bought, right? FDA, some mobile medical apps are actually regulated by the FDA. So if, for instance, you have one of the EKG machines, that'll tell you if you're an AFib, or if you have a blood pressure monitor that's connected to your iPhone, or if you have some of the iPhone apps will be regulated by the FDA. They're not yet, they're still working on it. If you have other medical devices that have software implications, mobile medical apps. Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, we lovingly call FDASIA, right? This is the alphabet soup of the law. Basically, ONC within HHS, the Office of the National Coordinator, and the FCC, Federal Communications Division, had to develop a framework. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, prevents unfair and deceptive acts related to commercial activity based on the idea that, all those privacy notices you get, and you have to click on the consent, and they take your cookies. This is the new one, right? They take your cookies, so you have to accept the fact that they're taking your cookies, which I like to think of as chocolate chip, but that's the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. And then all these others, the NTIA, FCRA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, et cetera, 21st Century Cures Act, including some FERPA, which is students, that's the employee. So if you have, that's education. So for instance, a school nurse in a high school would be covered by FERPA. Medicare claims data, SSA, ACA, some of you have probably worked with these databases. Lots of law. Ongoing issues, big data, huge. Research, public health, who holds it, who controls it. Electronic health records, personal health records, less important now than they used to be. Now it's all on your phone, but once you download the information from your doctor, from the portal, and now it's on your phone, it's no longer regulated because it's on your phone. So if somebody can get your phone, the phone itself is not regulated, but the electronic health record in your doctor's office is regulated. mHealth, we talked about anonymizing data, genomics, pharmacogenomics. Does anonymizing data, de-identification, does that even still exist in the era of whole genome sequencing? And AI. All right. So we're rounding the corner now. We're going to talk about these inventories that I mentioned. Two big ones. Last couple of years, more than 80 different ethical frameworks. Private companies, research institutions, public sector organizations. They vary in content and detail, but there are some common elements. What are they? So one was put out by the Health Ethics and Policy Lab in Switzerland, Zurich. So here's the citation down here, put out in September 2019. Everybody agrees, I mentioned this, that AI should be ethical. If I gave a poll in here today, which one of you is going to say, no, it doesn't need to be ethical, right? Like everybody agrees it should be ethical. The debate, however, is what in the world does that mean? What does ethical AI mean? Which ethical requirements that I talked about already, including the ones in the bubble and the ones, the ethical principles, which technical standards, and what are the best practices? That all changes. Nobody agrees on those bullets, but everybody agrees there should be ethical AI. Global convergence around 5 of the principles. Transparency, big one. So we covered that, openness. Justice and fairness, we talked about that. Non-maleficence, don't do bad. Above all, do no harm. Responsibility, kind of a wishy-washy word, isn't it? And privacy. But what's missing here? Beneficence, doing good. Does anything we do with AI need to do good, or do we simply need to not do bad? What do we demand from ourselves? Difference in how the principles are interpreted, why they are deemed important in each framework, what issue, domain, or actors they pertain to, and how they should be implemented. So the conclusions of this group. The findings highlight the importance of integrating guideline development efforts with substantive ethical analysis and adequate implementation strategies. Essentially what I mentioned at the beginning. Context, case-specific issues, and then strategies, how we're going to get there. An answer. You have to come to an answer, and then you have to outline how you're going to get there. The second one, put out by Algorithm Watch, which is a nonprofit organization in Europe. Title is the AI Ethics Guidelines Global Inventory. All frameworks include similar principles of, again, transparency, equality, non-discrimination, a little bit different, accountability, safety. Interesting, safety. Does that mean do no harm? Is that what safety means? Some add additional principles, such as the demand for AI be socially beneficial and protect human rights. Maybe that's the beneficence part that I couldn't find in the other one, right? These are their conclusions. Most frameworks developed by coalitions or institutions such as universities that invite companies and individuals to sign on. Only a few companies have developed their own frameworks. Facebook, Google, Microsoft. Almost all are voluntary commitments. Yeah, we're going to do this. Only 3 or 4 indicate an oversight or enforcement mechanism, meaning accountability. What's going to happen if it's violated? Most are from the past couple of years, and few included recommendations or examples of how to operationalize the principles. Conclusion. The absence of internal enforcement or governance mechanism shows that there is a lot of virtue signaling going on and few efforts of enforcement. Other commentators have called this ethics washing. If we put out an ethics statement, if we put out an ethics framework, then we are the ethical people. Yay for me, right? We're the good ones. We're the good ones. Ethics washing, virtue signaling. I love that language. Is it meaningless? this virtue signaling? These authors say no, because once you put out this virtue signal, people are going to hold you to it, either the outside world or maybe your own employees, as in the case of Google, right? Maybe, as in the case of Amazon and the Amazon algorithm that led to fewer hires of women, maybe your own employees will say, hey, we're working for you because you said you were this good company and you said you were going to do this, but what about this military contract you signed on to? And then we're going to walk out, and then Google's like, now we got to do something, right? Virtue signaling. Maybe it is useful. Maybe it's a push forward. Maybe it'll eventually lead to something. But the idea of all of these frameworks is there is no legal bite. It is not a regulation. It is not a state law. It is not a federal law. There might be laws in other countries that are closer, such as the GDPR in Europe. But the organizational frameworks that are put out are not. And even governments put out aspirational white papers, aspirational guidelines. The data ethics guidelines put out by the White House are aspirational. There's no law tied to it. Congress in this country now is working on an overall privacy law. Congress is working on a lot right now. Will we see it? Maybe. Maybe. I live in Washington, D.C. I don't bet on this stuff anymore. It's like I've lost too many times, right? So maybe we'll see it. Maybe it will be improvement. Maybe it won't. Because a lot of the general privacy laws that are written don't actually apply to healthcare information because it's already so well covered. So we've got about 5 minutes until something happens, right? So any questions, comments? I'm figuring there are probably more comments than questions, but I'm here for a few hours and you've got my email and I'm always open to it. But I have to tell you, I would love it if people that are actually doing these things really got involved in these angles and these frameworks and these guidelines and incorporating these concepts into your own papers, into your own classes, into your own research, because that's actually where it matters and what people are going to read. So integrated throughout your work is really what we need in order to be those good organizations, right? Any questions, comments now? I think it's time for a break otherwise, right? Up? Yeah. Can you walk up to the mic? Thanks.
Yes, my name is Jeff Gaither. I'm a bioinformatics scientist at Nationwide Children's. Thank you for that fascinating talk. I'm wondering, could you give us an example of an absolute moral principle?
So in my class this year, we talked about no pedophilia. That's as close as we got. Or no sexual abuse of children. Because nobody's willing to say, what about in this situation, right? Like nobody can come up with an exception there, right? Like that's as close as we got. That's as close as we got. I mean, do you have any in mind that?
So I'm a mathematician by training, and so I think of self-referential arguments. So if thing X is so bad, well, what if there's a supervillain that's going to do thing X 10 times if we don't do thing X here? And so it seems like you can, in some sense, you can always do something worse and supersede a supposedly absolute principle. Yeah.
So the idea, so if we think about euthanasia, all right? So euthanasia in this country is illegal, but it's not illegal in a few European countries under certain circumstances, right? Euthanasia is, we don't think, now, voluntary active euthanasia of someone who is perfectly fine is still illegal everywhere. But then we think about perhaps a person who cannot express that her will to have someone help her die now, but she wrote it in an advance directive before she got to the particular place. Or we think about, what about people with mental health issues? Does that mean that they're never able to use the laws for physician-assisted suicide in this country? No. you're not. But in other countries, there are some allowances. The idea of children or very severely disabled newborns. In other countries, sometimes it's legal. In this country, you know, in very, very rare circumstances. In this country, never. So when we you know, when you're trying to come up with absolute, you know, that's why we ended up with basically, you know, pedophilia. So, you know, thankfully nobody right now says, but in certain cases, right, you know, we're not getting there yet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes. I can't, could you go to the mic?
Can you go to the mic?
Thanks.
I'll ask my question while he's coming up. I'm the Chief Medical Information Officer for a local health system.
Okay. So
Just
you've heard of HIPAA?
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Practically speaking, technology vendors have an ethical code that's substantially lower than pharmaceutical reps. There's no regulation, at least the FDA regulates drugs. So they'll come in and tell you just about every claim about artificial intelligence. And I don't know if that's half because they're trying to generate startup funds or because they actually have a business case or a clinical case, but the hyperbole is huge. The other attribute that they have is that they want all of your data.
Oh, yeah.
Because they don't know where the gold is, but they have algorithms that will find it, and the more data, the better. So on a practical matter, on a day-to-day basis, I am dealing with requests for data sharing that are so nuanced, so complex, and the business associate agreements require weeks and months of analysis to understand. So how does a health system, how do researchers get their arms around this in a way that we can move forward? In my organization, we had a team of lawyers, a team of legal records reviewers that understood all of that acronym jargon. But it's a month-to-month slog. And so far, we've reviewed over 200 different business cases, legal agreements, with the goal of trying to advance science. So who does this well? What organization could publish those use cases, you know, spell out the pros and cons, the limitations, maybe give a certification to these vendors that we could feel confident in?
There are some of those certification organizations out there, but what I would say first is their widget, whatever it is that they have, does it suit your goals? Is this what you want? Is this the direction of the organization? Because if something goes wrong, it's not going to be them. It's going to be you, right? You're the responsible party to the public and to your patients. So what are your goals, your organizational ethics mantra, whatever it is? What are you shooting for? Like, they want all of your data because they're not sure where they're going yet, but that's the beauty of innovation, right? That's the beauty of the brilliant idea. But you might want them, I think, to be checked out a little bit more. Are they working with the FTC? Do they have their own people that are worried about what are they going to do with your data? Do they actually, will they go through an IRB, or are they like, oh no, we're not going to do that? Like, if you're shying away from somebody looking into your product and claiming proprietary, you know, business things, then what are you afraid of? You know, why can't we look into your product? They're trying to do a business deal with you, and honestly, you're helping them more than they're helping you at this point, right? Because that promise, that promise, who knows? It's a promise, it's a potential. I don't think you're gonna miss out on the next Fitbit or Schmidtbit, right? Like that's the thing. You'll be able to find it. And what is the added benefit to you of being the first one out there, the first one out of the box? I'm not sure, which is why healthcare institutions tend to be more hesitant to move forward. Like, look at Geisinger, look at Kaiser. They're very, very deliberate, slow-moving, but they also have been burned in the past, and they've learned these lessons. But I think working along those lines, I think this institution, you know, definitely has the reputation that you could be more choosy than this, like 200, they're coming to you because they need you. So, I mean, your lawyer's gonna tell you that, right? So it's like, dig into their stuff. How transparent are they? What are they gonna do with the data? Are you giving them aggregate or non-aggregate? What do the contracts look like? What happens to them if they screw up? What happens to you if they screw up? It's a bigger deal. Does that help? I sound like a lawyer, don't I? I was like, right.
These are all the questions, and we're on the cutting edge in such that, you know, the standards and the you know, the principles that you're describing today are not embedded in the fabric of any organization. We're making it up. There's not standard work around this. So I think that's the obligation of leading organizations is to do this, but I think we're all struggling with it at the same time.
Yeah,
So
it's
the
rough because, I mean, this is all new stuff and relatively new and might require someone with different training. And there are people out there that can help, right, that can help, that do this and that are, you know, that evaluate these. The thing about startups is that they're like, oh, but our idea is different than everybody else's idea. And so we can't share with you our secret sauce, but that you need to know what's in the secret sauce if you're giving them your data to play with, right? That's what I would say. Thanks.
We're going to take one more question, gentlemen.
Okay.
And then you'll be available during the break for some of these additional questions.
Absolutely.
Probably there's questions where you want to go, well, you know.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Andre. I'm also a bioinformatician at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And my question is, what's your opinion on monetization of personal data, such as genomics and things like that?
So my opinion, it makes me nervous, right? We all have this, right? We all have personal information that could be monetized. The case law talks about, there's a very famous case from California called Moore versus University of California, which included hairy cell leukemia and a person who had his spleen taken out at the University of California, who later came back and said that they didn't tell me in an informed consent way that they were going to sell my cell line, that they were going to make money from it, right? So he did win in that aspect because it wasn't disclosed to him that they were going to make, that the researchers were going to do something to his cell line and then make a lot of money for it. They kept requiring him to come back there for the blood draws. He lived in Oregon, but they kept coming back to Berkeley for the blood draws and everything, and they never told him why. So there was an informed consent issue. The piece of the case that is so famous is he wanted a cut from the process. And the Supreme Court of California, so it's a state law case, said, no, you can't get a cut because whatever it is that the researchers did to the cells made them different than what was in your spleen to begin with. So you can't have a cut of what they did because they did that, not you. You just gave them your spleen. That's tissue. That's a cell line. So when we think about data, making money off of data, everybody brings up the idea of 23andMe. So the idea is if 23andMe says, we're going to take your cheek swab, we're going to send you back this information, and are you going to let us send it to researchers? Are you going to let us sell it? And you say, yes, I'm cool with that, everything, and then they give it to researchers and they sell it, then you've quote unquote consented to it, right? But if they say, oh, I'm just taking your cheek swab and we're going to send the information back to you, but never say anything about researchers and never say anything about money, then they've done something with your data that they're not supposed to do. The question is, what if an organization tells you exactly what they're going to do with your data, and then they do something bad with your data, like what if they sell your data to white supremacists And they're using your data in a way that, yes, you knew they were going to sell it, but no, you never thought that they could sell it to white supremacist organizations. What do you do then? They told you. But are there some things that none of us would want our information to be used for? And do we have options that are granular to that level, right? Can we say, yes, you can use my data and you can sell it to everybody who's going to do something good, but no white supremacists, right? And then how do we define that bad thing? How do we know ahead of time? How do we think of anything possible that can happen from our data? So, I'm not a big fan of the selling thing, except people need to make money, and that's the idea behind innovation and patent and trademark and copyright, is that people will innovate and do new amazing things, all these startups, but they need a profit motive. Very few of them are doing it just because they want to make the world a better place. That might be part of it, but they also need a salary, right? So it's not exactly I'm not a big fan, but it's a complicated issue.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. I'll lurk around. Okay.